What if I told you that hidden on the coast of Northern Ireland are the ruins of a bridge built by a giant? Not a metaphorical giant, but a literal mountain-sized warrior who tore the earth apart with his bare hands to challenge his mortal enemy to a fight. Geologists will tell you a different story. They'll talk about volcanic fissures and cooling basalt lava flows 60 million years ago. They'll use words like columnar jointing to explain the 40,000 perfectly interlocking, hexagonal stone pillars that march from the cliffs and disappear under the waves. And their explanation makes a certain kind of sense. But it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why these perfect, six-sided columns seem to reappear miles away, on the coast of Scotland on the Isle of Staffa, as if they were once part of a single colossal highway across the sea. And it certainly doesn't explain the feeling you get when you stand there, on those strange alien-like stones, and you hear the wind howl with a voice that sounds like an ancient battle cry. The official story is one of geology, but the real story, the one whispered in pubs and passed down through generations for 1,000 years, is a story of rage, of cunning, and of a war between two titans that scarred the very face of the earth. This is the story of the giant's Causeway, and the legend of the man or the giant who built it, Finn Cumhaill. You might know him as Finn MacCool. To the ancient people of Ireland, Finn MacCool was more than a myth. He was a protector. He was the living embodiment of the spirit of the land, wild, strong, and fiercely proud. He was the leader of the Fionn, an elite band of warriors and heroes who were Ireland's first and last line of defense. They were said to be so fast they could outrun a deer, so strong they could bend iron, and so in tune with nature they could hear the grass grow. And Finn was the greatest of them all. He wasn't just a brute. He was a poet, a seer, and a brilliant strategist. Legend says he gained all the world's knowledge by tasting the salmon of wisdom, a magical fish that had eaten 9 hazelnuts that fell into the well of Sagai's. By simply touching his thumb to his tooth, Finn could see the future and solve any riddle. He was a king without a crown, a hero whose loyalty was to the people of Ireland, not to any throne. He stood an impossible 54 feet tall, and when he walked, the ground trembled. He could stride across valleys in a single step and drink from rivers without bending his knees. He was a force of nature, a guardian who kept Ireland safe from all threats, both mortal and supernatural. For years, he and the Fionn were the undisputed champions of their land. But across the narrow sea in the misty highlands of Scotland, another giant was stirring. A giant whose power was matched only by his arrogance. His name was Benandonner, the Red Man. Benandonner was everything Finn was not. Where Finn was clever, Benandonner was brutish. Where Finn was a protector, Benandonner was a destroyer. He was a monstrous figure, even larger than Finn, with a shock of fiery red hair and a temper to match. He saw himself as the true king of the giants, and the very existence of a rival in Ireland was an insult he could not bear. From his castle on the Scottish coast, he would bellow insults across the water, his voice a thunderclap that rolled over the hills of Antrim. He called Finn a coward, a fraud. He mocked the Fionn, calling them Finn's lapdogs. He claimed that Ireland was nothing but a stepping stone for his conquest, and that he would one day wade across the sea and crush Finn MacCool under his heel. For a long time, Finn ignored the taunts. He was a leader, not a brawler. He had more important things to do than entertain the chest beating of a Scottish brute. He had his people to protect, his lands to watch over. But Benandonner was relentless. The insults grew louder, more personal, more venomous. The Scottish giant boasted that he had a wife who baked cakes with iron griddles inside them, a testament to his own strength. He claimed Finn's famous wisdom was nothing but a fairy tale, a story told to children to hide his weakness. Day after day, the taunts echoed across the North Channel. The people of Ulster grew fearful. They looked to their champion, their protector, and they saw his patience wearing thin. Finn's hands, large enough to crush boulders into dust, clenched into fists. His jaw, as firm as the cliffs of Moher, tightened with rage. The final straw came on a day when the wind carried Benandonner's voice with chilling clarity. "Finn Cumhaill," the voice boomed. "You are no giant. You are a frightened little man hiding on your pathetic little island. If only you could swim, I would have drowned you already." That was it. The insult was not just to Finn but to his home, to Ireland itself. In that moment, something inside the great hero snapped. All the wisdom, all the strategy, all the calm leadership was washed away by a primal tide of fury. He strode to the coast of Antrim, the very edge of his domain, and stared across the churning grey water toward the hazy silhouette of Scotland. He would not swim. He would not sail. He would meet his enemy on his own terms on solid ground. With a roar that shook the heavens, Finn MacCool turned to the land he had sworn to protect. He reached down and with his bare hands, he ripped a colossal chunk of the Antrim coast from the earth. Heaving and straining, he hurled the mass of rock and soil into the sea. It landed with a cataclysmic splash, the waves from the impact crashing against shores miles away. But it held. It was the first stone. He tore another piece and another and another. He worked in a feverish rage, his muscles straining against the very bedrock of the island. He was no longer building a path. He was building a declaration of war. A causeway of stone, a challenge set in the earth itself stretching across the sea. Each pillar he drove into the seabed was a promise. Promise that he was coming. A promise of a battle that would shake the world. He didn't know it yet, but he was building a monument that would outlast his own legend. A bridge to a confrontation that would not be decided by strength alone, but by a desperate gamble that would change everything. For weeks, the coast of Antrim was a symphony of destruction and creation. The air, once filled with the cry of gulls and the whisper of the sea, now rang with the percussive thunder of stone on stone. Finn MacCool, fueled by a rage as vast as the ocean he sought to conquer, worked with a singular, terrifying focus. He didn't quarry stones. He tore them, screaming, from the heart of the cliffs. He ripped hexagonal pillars of basalt from their ancient beds, each one a perfect six-sided spear of volcanic rock, cool and heavy in his colossal hands. He waded into the churning Irish Sea, the waves that would splinter ships merely lapping at his knees, and drove the columns deep into the seabed. Boom! Another pillar driven home like a nail. The impact sent shockwaves shuddering through the water, stunning fish for miles. Boom! Another. A tremor ran through the land, rattling cottages miles inland, where people whispered that the old magic was awake and angry. He worked without rest, his muscles burning, his knuckles raw and bleeding. This was more than a bridge. It was an insult hurled across the water. It was a challenge written in stone, a road of pure fury paved directly to his enemy's doorstep. Each pillar was a word in a sentence of defiance, and the sentence was simple: I am coming for you. And across the water, in the misty highlands of Scotland, his challenge was heard. Not in words, but in the vibrations traveling through the very bones of the earth. There Benandonner, the Red Man, the terror of the Isles, stirred. If Finn was a mountain, Benandonner was a mountain range. His hair was a shock of fiery red, like a burning forest. His skin was ruddy, chapped by the highland winds and scarred from 1,000 meaningless brawls. And his size was a thing of nightmares. It was said that when Benandonner sat upon a Scottish mountain, he could use the neighboring peak as an armrest. He didn't just walk upon the land strained beneath his weight. He was not a builder, he was a breaker. Where Finn was a force of focused creation, Benandonner was an agent of pure chaos. He had heard the taunts carried on the wind, the boasts of the Irish champion, and he had laughed. It was a horrible sound, like rocks grinding together in an avalanche. Finn MacCool? The big fish in a small pond? Benandonner had crushed men bigger than Finn for looking at him the wrong way. He watched with a single massive eye. Some legends say his other was lost in a fight with a sea serpent, as the impossible bridge of stone grew closer to his shores day by day. He didn't build a path to meet Finn. He didn't need to. He would simply wait for the fool to deliver himself to his own annihilation. He sharpened his monstrous axe, a weapon so large it was rumored to be forged from a fallen star, and he waited, his patience as vast and cold as a highland winter. Finally, the day came. With a final earth-shattering slam, Finn drove the last column into place, connecting the coast of Ireland to the Scottish Isle of Staffa. The giant's causeway was complete, a magnificent, impossible highway of interlocking stones stretching as far as the eye could see. Wiping the sweat and grime from his brow, Finn let out a roar of triumph that sent seabirds scattering for 100 miles. He had done it. He had built his road to war. He placed one giant foot on the first stone, then another. He began his march, his heart pounding with the thrill of impending battle. The causeway was solid beneath him, a testament to his own power. The sea spray felt cool on his skin. The Scottish coast, once a hazy dream on the horizon, grew clearer and more menacing with every step. He strode with the confidence of a king, a champion, the strongest being in all of Ireland. He was halfway across when he saw him. Benandonner stood on the shores of Staffa, silhouetted against the gray sky. And in that moment, the fire in Finn MacCool's blood turned to ice. The stories, the boasts, the legends, they had all been understatements. Benandonner wasn't just bigger than Finn. He was to Finn what Finn was to an ordinary man. He was a primal force given form. The sheer scale of him defied reason. His shoulders blocked out the sky. The axe he held casually in one hand was the size of a full-grown oak tree. Finn stopped dead in his tracks. Every ounce of his rage, his pride, his warrior spirit, evaporated in a wave of pure, cold, intelligent fear. This wasn't a fight. This was an execution. Winning was impossible. Surviving was unlikely. For the first time in his life, Finn MacCool, the leader of the Fianna, the giant of Antrim, the hero of 100 Tales, turned and ran. His feet pounded on the very stones he had just laid with such pride. The causeway that was meant to be his path to glory was now his desperate escape route. He didn't dare look back, but he could hear it. A low chuckle that rumbled across the water like an earthquake, followed by footsteps. Thump! The entire causeway vibrated. Thump! A wave crashed over the stones, drenching him in cold sea water. Benandonner was coming, and he was fast. Finn fled, his heart hammering against his ribs, the humiliation of his retreat drowned out by the sheer terror of the pursuit. He scrambled onto the Irish shore, not even looking back to see his magnificent creation, and sprinted towards his home on the slopes of Knockmany Hill. He burst through the door of his fortress, a door built for a giant, yet he had to stoop. The crash of it closing echoed like a thunderclap. His wife Unak looked up from the hearth. She was a giantess, to be sure, but her power wasn't in her size. It was in her eyes. They were sharp, clever, and right now they saw everything. They saw the wild panic in her husband's face, the man who feared nothing, now trembling like a leaf. She didn't gasp. She didn't scream. She simply put down her weaving and said, in a voice as calm as a still lake, "He's bigger than you, isn't he?" Finn could only nod, panting, struggling for words. "Unak, I can't fight him. No one can. He's not a giant. He's a walking apocalypse. He'll tear down the house. He'll destroy everything." Unak walked over to him and placed a hand on his arm. Her touch was steadying. "Then you won't fight him," she said, her mind already spinning, weaving a plan far more intricate than any tapestry. "Not with your fists, anyway." Outside, the ground began to tremble, a slow, rhythmic shaking that grew stronger with every second. Thump! The crockery on the shelves rattled. Thump! A deep shadow fell over the doorway, blotting out the sun. Benandonner had crossed the causeway. He was here. Finn looked at his wife, his face a mask of despair. "It's too late. What can we do?" Unaka's eyes glinted with a spark of impossible genius. She looked at her husband, the mighty Finn MacCool, and then at the enormous baby's cradle they had built years ago for their son. A plan so audacious, so utterly insane it just might work, bloomed fully formed in her mind. She grabbed a pile of linen wraps and a baby's bonnet. "There's no time to explain," she said, her voice a sharp, urgent whisper. "Take off your armor and get in the cradle. Now." Finn stared at his wife, then at the oversized cradle by the hearth, then back at his wife. The cradle was sturdy, yes, built from the trunk of a single oak tree, but it was still a cradle. For a moment, the only sound was the frantic pounding of his own heart and the distant, rhythmic thunder of Benandonner's approach. A giant of a man, a hero of Ireland, being told to climb into a piece of furniture meant for an infant. It was beyond insane. It was an insult. "The cradle?" he finally managed to stammer, his voice a low rumble of disbelief. "Unak, have you lost your senses? I am Finn MacCool. I do not hide in cradles." Her eyes, usually so full of warmth and laughter, were now like chips of flint. She shoved the linen wraps into his chest. "Will you be Finn MacCool the brave or Finn MacCool the dead? That is the choice before you. Benandonner is not just bigger than you, Finn. He is a monster of pure rage. He will not fight you with honor. He will tear this house apart to find you, and then he will tear you apart. Now, for the love of Ireland and for the love of me, get in the cradle." Every instinct in Finn's body screamed in protest. His pride, his warrior spirit, the very core of his being recoiled at the idea. Hiding was for cowards. Deception was for lesser men. He had faced down armies, mythical beasts, and treacherous kings. He had never ever run from a fight. But then he looked into Unaka's face, and he saw not fear, but a terrifying, brilliant certainty. He saw a plan. He had to trust her. In a battle of swords and shields, he was the master. But this was a different kind of war, a war of wits and nerve, and in that arena, Unak was the undefeated champion. With a groan that seemed to shake the very foundations of his soul, Finn began to unbuckle his heavy leather armor. Each piece clattered to the stone floor with a sound of finality, a surrender of his identity. He was no longer the great general, the fearsome warrior. He was just a man, following his wife's mad instructions as the footsteps of his doom grew louder and louder. He stepped into the massive cradle, the wood groaning under his weight. It was a tight fit. He had to curl himself into a ball, his knees practically touching his chin. It was humiliating. It was absurd. Unak worked with a speed and focus that was breathtaking. She wrapped the linen cloths around him, swaddling him like a true infant, tucking his powerful arms and legs into a helpless bundle. Then came the bonnet. She pulled it down over his fiery red hair and tied the ribbons tightly under his chin, the delicate fabric looking utterly ridiculous against his beard-stubbled jaw. "And one last thing," she whispered, her face inches from his. The ground was now vibrating with a steady, ominous rhythm. "Put your thumb in your mouth, and no matter what you hear, no matter what you see, you do not move. You do not speak. You just lie here and be my beautiful bouncing baby boy." He wanted to argue. He wanted to roar. But he saw the sheer, desperate genius of it all clicking into place. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath that smelled of linen and his own fear, and stuck his thumb in his mouth. He felt like the world's biggest fool. He was not a moment too soon. Boom. The sound wasn't a knock. It was a concussion. The heavy oak door of their home splintered, ripped from its iron hinges as if it were made of parchment. It flew across the room and smashed against the far wall, exploding into a shower of wooden shards. The light from the doorway was blotted out. A shadow fell over the room, a shadow so vast and absolute it felt like a personal eclipse. And in the doorway, stooping to fit, was Benandonner. He was larger than the legends, so much larger. His head brushed the top of the massive doorframe. His shoulders were as wide as a cart. His skin was the color of granite, etched with crude, swirling tattoos, and his eyes were small, red, and burned with a hateful fire. A thick, matted red beard, even more wild and unkempt than Finn's, covered a jaw that looked strong enough to chew through stone. The air crackled with his presence, thick with the smell of sweat, rain, and cold, raw fury. He scanned the room, his gaze sweeping over the shattered door, the scattered armor, the roaring hearth. His nostrils flared. "I smell him," he growled, his voice a landslide of gravel and rock. "I smell the coward Finn MacCool. Where is he hiding? Tell me, little woman, before I use your husband's spine to pick my teeth." And then Unak stepped forward. She moved not with fear, but with the weary annoyance of a housewife whose afternoon has been rudely interrupted. She placed her hands on her hips, looked at the colossal giant who had just destroyed her door, and sighed. "Well, now look at the mess you've made," she said, her voice as calm and steady as a summer stream. "And here I was just getting the wee one down for his nap. Some people have no manners at all." Benandonner was so taken aback by her lack of terror that he actually took a half step back. He had expected screaming. He had expected begging. He had not expected to be scolded for his poor etiquette. "Woman, I am Benandonner," he roared, trying to regain his momentum. "I have crossed the sea on a path of my own making to crush your husband's skull." "Is that so?" Unak replied, beginning to sweep up the splinters of the door with a broom. "Well, you've had a long journey then. My Finn is not here. He's out hunting, tending to the herds. Always working, that man. Never a moment's rest." She gestured with her head toward the hearth. "You must be exhausted after all that walking. Come and sit down. Rest your feet. I was just making some griddle cakes. You look like a man who could eat a dozen or two." The sheer, audacious normalcy of her invitation completely disarmed the Scottish giant. His rage was a fire that needed fear to fuel it, and this woman was giving him none. All he was getting was hospitality. Confused, his mind struggling to process this unexpected turn of events, he lumbered into the house. He sat on a massive stone bench, which groaned in protest. "My Finn will be home soon," Unak continued, her voice light and conversational as she flipped a griddle cake the size of a wagon wheel. "He has a terrible temper when he's hungry, you know. I'd hate for you to be on the wrong side of it." She slid a pile of the cakes onto a platter and placed it before Benandonner. "Here, try one of these while you wait." Benandonner, his stomach rumbling, grabbed a cake and took a massive bite, and immediately roared in pain, spitting out 2 of his own broken teeth. "Arg! What is this?" "It's rock." Unak feigned surprise. "Oh my goodness! You have to have strong teeth to eat my Finn's bread. He just grinds them up no problem at all. Says it keeps his jaw strong for battle." She then walked over to a second, smaller stack of cakes, picked one up and took a delicate bite. It was soft and fluffy. She handed the rest of it to the cradle. "Here you go, my sweet boy. You must be hungry too." From inside the cradle, a muffled gurgling sound could be heard. Benandonner stared, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and disbelief. He watched Unak coo at the bundle in the cradle, his massive mind trying to connect the dots. The man of the house eats bread made of stone. The woman is unnaturally calm. And there is a baby. "A baby?" Benandonner grunted, nursing his shattered jaw. "You have a child?" "Oh yes," Unak said, smiling proudly as she gently rocked the cradle. "Our first. A boy. He's the spitting image of his father." Benandonner's curiosity, a rare emotion for him, got the better of his anger. A man who ate rocks for bread. What kind of son would such a man produce? He stood up, the floorboards groaning, and stomped over to the cradle. He peered down over the edge, and what he saw made the blood freeze in his veins. Lying there, swaddled in linen and wearing a ridiculous little bonnet, was a baby of immense size. It had a thick, fiery red beard, and its bicep, barely contained by the wraps, was thicker than Benandonner's own thigh. A massive thumb was plugged firmly in its mouth. The baby's eyes were closed, but even in sleep, it looked impossibly, unnervingly strong. Benandonner looked at the gargantuan infant. He looked at the griddle cake with the iron pan baked inside it. He thought about the man, the father, who casually ate such things. And then he did a simple, terrifying calculation in his head. This thing was the baby. How terrifyingly, impossibly, monstrously huge must the father be? The thought was a crack of thunder in the silent fortress of his mind. A single horrifying equation that his brain, built for brute force and simple violence, could barely contain. The baby's finger was thicker than his own arm. The baby's tooth had shattered his own. The baby was a baby, and all babies have fathers. Benandonner's blood ran cold. Not a chill, not a shiver, but a deep primal freeze that seized his muscles and stole the air from his lungs. He looked from the cradle to the empty hearth, to the massive pots and pans, to the doorway that suddenly seemed far, far too small. Every object in this house, which moments ago had seemed merely large, now seemed impossibly, apocalyptically gargantuan. It was all a matter of scale. He had been looking at it all wrong. This wasn't the home of a giant his size. This was the home of a god, a titan, a creature whose true form he could not, and did not want, to imagine. He swallowed, but his throat was desert dry. The casual confidence that had carried him across the sea, the swagger that had defined his very existence, it all evaporated into a foul, greasy mist of pure terror. He had come here for a fight, for glory, to prove he was the strongest. What a fool he'd been. This wasn't a fight. This was an execution. He had walked, whistling, into his own tomb. He had to get out. The thought wasn't a plan, it was an instinct. A raw, animal command that overrode everything else. His feet, clumsy with panic, stumbled backward. He knocked over a stool the size of a small boulder, the crash echoing in the sudden, deafening silence of the cottage. He didn't even notice. His eyes were locked on the cradle, on the sleeping behemoth child who could break his teeth with a single bite. He pictured the father, Finn MacCool, returning home. He imagined the ground shaking with his footsteps. He imagined a shadow falling over the son as he stooped to enter his own home. He imagined the casual, offhand way this monster would greet his wife, before turning his gaze, a gaze from eyes like twin moons, upon the intruder. the Scottish gnat who had dared to challenge him. Benandonner turned and fled. He didn't run. He scrambled. He clawed his way out of the cottage, his massive shoulders scraping against the doorframe, a shower of stone and splintered wood raining down behind him. He burst out into the Irish sunlight, but it brought no warmth, no comfort. The world felt alien, hostile. The green hills of Antrim were no longer beautiful. They were the walls of a trap. The sea was no longer a path home. It was a moat he had to cross before the beast was awakened. He hit the causeway at a full, desperate sprint. His heart hammered against his ribs like a war drum, a frantic, panicked rhythm that drowned out the sound of the waves. His mind was a maelstrom of fear and self-preservation. He had to get back to Scotland. He had to put the sea between himself and that family. But as his giant feet pounded on the hexagonal stones, a new emotion began to bubble up through the terror. Rage. A blistering, humiliated fury. He had been tricked. He had been made a fool of. The greatest giant in Scotland, a legend in his own right, had been sent fleeing by a baby. The thought was so deeply, profoundly shameful it was almost as terrifying as the prospect of meeting the father. He couldn't let this stand. He couldn't let this insult remain. More importantly, he couldn't let Finn MacCool follow him. The rage and the fear combined into a singular, destructive purpose. He reached the middle of the causeway, the narrow bridge of stone connecting the two lands, and he stopped. He turned, his face a twisted mask of fury, and looked back at the Irish coast. He would not be followed. He would sever the link. He would tear this bridge from the world and ensure that whatever colossal horror lived in that cottage would be confined to its own island forever. He roared, a sound of pure primal fury that sent seabirds scattering for miles. He bent down, his massive hands gripping the edges of the causeway. The basalt columns, packed tight by forces of nature over millennia, groaned in protest. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he ripped a section of the causeway free. The sound was like the world cracking in two, a thunderous, grinding shriek of stone on stone. He lifted the massive chunk of rock, hexagonal pillars clinging together like a great stone honeycomb, and hurled it into the churning sea. The water exploded upwards in a colossal plume of white spray. The waves crashed against the remaining stones, hungry and violent. But Benandonner wasn't finished. He was a force of destruction now, a whirlwind of panic and pride. He stomped and kicked, his giant boots shattering the pillars into rubble. He tore up section after section, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He worked his way backward, destroying the path as he retreated, ensuring there was no way back. No way for Finn MacCool to pursue him to Scotland and exact a terrible revenge for the intrusion. He kicked and tore and smashed until his hands were raw and bleeding, until his muscles screamed in protest. He didn't stop until he was back on Scottish soil, standing on the edge of his own coast, looking out at the ruin he had created. Where a proud, unbroken bridge had once stood, there was now only a jagged stump of a path leading out into a furious sea. The Irish side was the same, a magnificent, bizarre staircase that now led to nowhere. The middle, the connection, was gone, swallowed by the waves, a testament to a giant's terror. Panting, bleeding, utterly defeated, Benandonner looked at his work. He had saved himself. He had escaped, but he had also trapped himself. He would never again be able to cross that sea. He would never again challenge the giants of Ireland. He looked at his own reflection in a rock pool, at his broken tooth and his terrified eyes, and he felt a shame so profound it would follow him for the rest of his days. He had met his match, not in strength but in cunning, and he had lost. Back in the cottage on the Antrim coast, the distant, thunderous crashing had finally stopped. The very foundations of the house had been trembling, the sound of a world being unmade echoing across the hills. Unac and Finn waited in the silence, listening. Finn still wrapped in his swaddling clothes, his heart beating a steady, calm rhythm. Unac, her face a mask of anxious concentration, her ear tilted toward the door. Slowly, carefully, Finn unwrapped himself from the blankets and climbed out of the enormous cradle. He stood up, not a baby, not a monster, but a man. A very large man, to be sure, but a man nonetheless. He was tall and powerful, but he was dwarfed by the memory of Benandonner, dwarfed by the very furniture in his own home. He looked at his wife, a question in his eyes. Unac walked to the doorway and peered out. She looked toward the coast, toward the place where their grand causeway had met the sea. She saw it, or rather she saw what was left of it, a beautiful, strange, and utterly broken road, its magnificent pillars marching defiantly into the waves before abruptly stopping, ending in chaos and churning water. The bridge to Scotland was gone. A slow smile spread across her face. She turned back to her husband, her eyes sparkling with a fierce, brilliant light, the light of intelligence, the light of victory. Finn MacCool hadn't thrown a single punch. He hadn't flexed a single muscle in anger. But he had won. Or rather, they had won. Through a clever plan, a bit of baking, and a deep understanding of the fragile pride that lives in the heart of every bully, they had defeated an enemy who, by all rights, should have crushed him. They had turned his greatest strength, his overwhelming size, into his greatest weakness. The legend of Finn MacCool, the great warrior, was already known throughout Ireland. But on that day a new legend was born. The legend of Finn MacCool, the giant of wits, the cleverest man in all the land, who outsmarted the monster at his door and, in doing so, gave the world one of its most breathtaking and mysterious wonders. And so the great Scottish giant Benandonner fled. He scrambled back across the bridge he had so proudly built, his heart pounding a rhythm of pure terror against his ribs. He didn't just run. He tore the path up as he went, ripping the massive stone columns from the sea and hurling them into the churning water, ensuring that the terrifyingly powerful Finn MacCool, or rather the monstrous baby he believed to be Finn's son, could never ever follow him. He didn't stop until he reached the shores of Scotland, collapsing in a heap, forever grateful for the sliver of ocean that now separated him from the horrors he had witnessed in Ireland. The bridge was broken, the connection was severed, and on the Irish side a wave of relief, followed by a roar of celebration, swept across the land. Finn MacCool, the giant who had faced down his nemesis not with his fists but with his mind, was no longer just a strongman. He was a hero of a different caliber. The story spread like wildfire, carried on the winds from the coast of Antrim to the hills of Kerry. It was a tale told in hushed, reverent tones around crackling peat fires, a story sung by bards in the halls of chieftains. It wasn't just a story about a fight. It was a lesson. It was a testament to the idea that wit could triumph over wrath, that cleverness was a weapon more formidable than any club or sword. Unac, his brilliant wife, was celebrated as the architect of the victory, her quick thinking a source of pride and inspiration. Together they had saved their home, protected their people, and cemented a legacy that would echo through the ages. The causeway, or what was left of it, became a monument to this legendary encounter. The strange, perfectly shaped stones were no longer just a geological curiosity. They were the handiwork of a giant, the remnants of a bridge between two titans. For thousands of years this was the truth. It was a truth etched not in stone, but in the collective memory of a people. The story of Finn and Benandonner explained the inexplicable. It gave a name and a purpose to the 40,000 interlocking basalt columns that stepped out of the green cliffs and into the cold gray waters of the North Atlantic. It was a story so powerful, so fitting, that it became as real and as solid as the ground beneath their feet. It was the story of the giant's causeway. But what if I told you that beneath this incredible legend lies another story? A story not of two giants, but of one unimaginably vast, planet-sized giant. A story of a battle not between two men, but between forces so immense they make mountains tremble and oceans boil. This is the story that science tells us. And in its own way, it is every bit as epic, as violent, and as magical as the legend of Finn MacCool. To understand it, we have to journey back in time. Not a few thousand years, but 60 million years. Back to an era when the world was a vastly different place. A place of fire and fury. Welcome to the Paleocene epoch. The dinosaurs were gone, wiped out by a cataclysm from the heavens, and the age of mammals was just beginning. The continents we know today were still drifting, grinding their way towards their modern positions. The Atlantic Ocean was younger, narrower, and far more volatile. And the land that would one day become Ireland, Scotland, and Greenland was being torn apart by immense geological stress. The Earth's crust was stretching, thinning like taffy being pulled, and where the crust thins, it eventually breaks. 60 million years ago, this region sat atop a massive volcanic hotspot, a plume of molten rock rising from deep within the Earth's mantle. This pressure from below, combined with the stretching of the crust above, created a scene of unimaginable geological violence. Fissures, great cracks in the earth miles long, ripped open across the landscape. And from these wounds, the planet began to bleed fire. This wasn't the kind of volcanic eruption we picture today, with a single, cone-shaped mountain like Mount Vesuvius or Mount St. Helens. This was a flood of basalt. Imagine a river of rock, heated to over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, pouring out across the land. It wasn't thick and pasty. This basaltic lava was incredibly fluid, flowing with the consistency of hot honey, but with the destructive power of a moving sea of fire. It surged across the ancient landscape, filling valleys, swallowing forests, and incinerating everything in its path. Layer upon layer of this molten rock spread out, creating a vast, flat, fiery plateau that stretched for hundreds of square miles. The Antrim Plateau was born, a new landscape forged in the planet's internal furnace. For a time, this part of the world was a hellscape, a sea of glowing orange and black, shimmering under a sky choked with ash and sulfur. But as with all things, the fire eventually cooled. The eruption subsided, and the great lava sea began to lose its heat to the cooler air and sea. And this is where the real magic, the true artistry of nature, begins. It's a process called columnar jointing, and it is the secret behind the Causeway's breathtaking design. Think about what happens when a puddle of mud dries in the sun. As the water evaporates, the mud shrinks, it contracts. This contraction creates stress, and the mud relieves that stress by cracking. You've seen the patterns, a network of cracks that often form polygonal, many-sided shapes. Now, take that simple principle and apply it to a sheet of molten rock hundreds of feet thick. As the top surface of the lava plateau cooled first, exposed to the air, it began to solidify and contract. This created tension across the entire surface. To relieve this tension, the rock had to crack. But it didn't crack randomly. Physics is not random. The cracks started to form at the surface, at evenly spaced centers, and propagated downwards as the cooling front moved deeper into the lava flow. And what is the most efficient way for nature to crack a surface, to relieve tension equally in all directions? It's not a square. It's not a triangle. It's a hexagon. A six-sided shape is nature's perfect pattern. It's the strongest, most stable, and most efficient way to tile a flat plane, leaving no gaps. It's why bees build their honeycombs with hexagonal cells. It provides the most storage space with the least amount of wax. It's the same principle that governs the formation of some snowflakes. In the cooling basalt, the cracks formed a vast, interlocking network of hexagons, creating thousands upon thousands of individual prisms, or columns. These cracks slowly, methodically, drove their way down through the cooling lava, like a crystal mold being pressed from above. The process was incredibly slow, taking centuries, perhaps millennia, for the entire lava flow to cool and for the columns to form from top to bottom. So when you stand on the Giant's Causeway today, you are not standing on stones that were carved or placed there. You are standing on the cross-section of an ancient river of fire. Each column is a single, solid piece of basalt, fractured from its neighbors by the immense slow-motion power of cooling. The tops are worn flat by the relentless action of millions of years of wind, rain, and battering waves, creating the illusion of a meticulously laid pavement of stepping stones. This geological story transforms the Causeway from a work of giants into a masterpiece of physics. It replaces the myth of Finn MacCool's rage and Unaka's cunning with the equally awe-inspiring story of planetary forces, of continental drift, volcanic floods, and the beautiful, predictable mathematics of cooling rock. The legend gave us a hero. The science gives us a glimpse into the raw, creative power of the Earth itself. But this is only part of the story. The science explains the how the columns were formed in their perfect hexagonal shapes. But it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the sheer variety of the landscape. Why are some columns toweringly tall, forming features that locals dub the Giant's Organ? Why do others stand alone like sentinels, known as the chimney stacks? And most tantalizingly of all, how do we explain the fact that on an island just across the water, on the coast of Scotland, there exists another set of identical basalt columns, a geological mirror image known as Fingal's Cave? It seems Benandonner didn't destroy his bridge quite as thoroughly as he thought. The story of the Causeway isn't just one of fire, it's also one of ice. To truly understand the wonder we see today, we must add another colossal force to our story: the crushing, sculpting power of the Ice Age. The Earth for millions of years had held a secret. Buried deep beneath layers of softer chalk, clay, and sediment, The masterpiece of the Paleocene volcano lay dormant, a hidden kingdom of stone. The fire had done its work, forging the columns with unimaginable heat and pressure. But the world had grown cold. A new power was descending from the north, a force of such immense scale and chilling patience that it would make the volcanic fury of the past seem like a fleeting spark. This was the age of ice. Imagine a river of ice, not of water. A glacier. Now imagine that river is a mile thick and hundreds of miles wide. An advancing wall of frozen power. This wasn't a gentle snowfall. This was an invasion. An unstoppable, grinding leviathan of compressed snow and ice, so heavy it depressed the very crust of the earth beneath it. Over tens of thousands of years, these colossal ice sheets advanced and retreated across northern Europe, and Ireland lay directly in their path. The world that had once glowed with molten lava was about to be entombed in a deep freeze. This wasn't just a blanket of cold. It was an active, destructive, and creative force. As the glaciers crept south over the Antrim coast, they became the world's largest bulldozer and its most powerful sandblaster, all in one. The sheer weight of the ice was immense, but the real work was done at its base. Embedded within the bottom layer of the glacier were millions of tons of rock and debris, from tiny grains of sand to boulders the size of houses. This abrasive underbelly acted like cosmic-grade sandpaper. As the ice sheet moved, it scoured the land. It scraped and ground away the soft upper layers of chalk that had covered the basalt for 60 million years. Meter by meter, millennium by millennium, the ice planed the surface, stripping away the earth that had kept the columns hidden. It was a planetary excavation project. The land was being peeled back, layer by layer, revealing the harder, more resilient rock beneath. The basalt, born of fire, was strong enough to resist the ice's full grinding power in a way the softer rock around it simply couldn't. So, the first great act of the ice was one of revelation. It was the Great Unveiling. Without the glaciers, the Giant's Causeway might still be buried today, a geological secret known only to drilling rigs and seismologists. The ice was the force that brought it into the light. But the glaciers did more than just uncover the causeway. They were sculptors, shaping the entire coastline into the dramatic landscape we see today. As the ice flowed, it exploited any weakness in the rock. It would seep into cracks, freeze, expand, and shatter huge chunks of stone in a process called frost wedging. It plucked massive blocks from cliff sides and dragged them for miles, leaving behind steep, jagged faces. The rolling hills of Antrim were carved into sweeping glacial valleys. The very cliffs upon which the causeway sits were sharpened and defined by this relentless, frozen artist. Look at the features surrounding the main causeway. The towering pillars known as the Giant's Organ, for instance. These perfectly vertical columns were once part of a larger mass of basalt, but the ice flowing around them scoured away the weaker, less organized rock, leaving this incredible formation isolated and exposed, like a divine instrument waiting to be played. The same is true for the formations known as the chimney stacks, which stand alone, sentinels on the headland. Legend says Finn MacCool built them as chimneys for his house, but geology tells us they are the resilient survivors of a glacial onslaught, hard basalt cores that withstood the grinding ice while the surrounding land was carried away. The ice was a master of subtraction, carving away everything that was not the masterpiece to reveal the form within. And then, as the climate warmed, the retreat began. But the melting of the ice was an event just as dramatic and transformative as its arrival. The retreat wasn't a quiet, gentle thaw. It was a chaotic and violent unleashing of water. Imagine billions of tons of ice melting. This wasn't a river, it was a deluge. Torrents of meltwater, thick with gravel and sediment, gushed from the decaying ice sheets. These new temporary rivers were more powerful than any we see today, and they performed the final act of sculpting. This meltwater washed away the immense piles of debris the glaciers had left behind. It sluiced through the newly exposed columns of the causeway, cleaning them of mud and clay. It was a high-pressure wash on a geological scale, polishing the tops of the stones, defining their hexagonal edges, and carving out the channels and gullies between them. It was the finishing touch. The fire had forged the raw material, the ice had performed the rough carving and brought it to light, and now the meltwater was providing the final polish, preparing the causeway for its debut to the world. When the last of the great ice sheets finally receded from Ireland, around 15,000 years ago, the work was done. The land it left behind was raw, battered, and utterly transformed. It was a new world. The air was clean, the ice was gone, and the sun shone down on a coastline that no human, no animal had ever seen before. And there it was, the giant's Causeway, not buried, not hidden, but sitting proudly on the edge of the wild North Atlantic. A staircase of 40,000 stone pillars, stepping down from the cliffs into the sea. A structure so perfect, so geometric, so utterly impossible in its precision, that it looked like the work of intelligent hands. The stage, forged by fire and sculpted by ice, was now set. The curtain of the Ice Age had been pulled back. And into this new empty world, the first people began to arrive. Small bands of hunter-gatherers migrating across the newly revealed land bridges, exploring a world fresh from its icy baptism. Imagine being one of them. You've spent your life in a world of forests, rivers, and rolling hills. You understand wood and stone and bone. And then one day, you round the headland of the Antrim coast and you see this thing, this pavement of pillars. It's not natural. It can't be. It doesn't follow any of the rules of the world, you know. It must have been built. But who could build such a thing? What kind of being possesses the power to forge and place thousands of perfect stone columns? It's a question that would echo through the millennia. The geology provides the how, but for the first humans to witness it, the only question that mattered was, who? They had no concept of hexagonal cooling basalt or glacial scouring. To explain the impossible sight before them, they would need a story. They would need a legend. They would need a giant. And his name was Finn Cumhaill, or as the ages would smooth his name for English tongues, Finn MacCool. But what kind of giant? Not some lumbering, dim-witted brute from a children's fairy tale. No, Finn was Ireland itself, made flesh and stone. He was a chieftain, a warrior, a poet, and the leader of the Fionn, a legendary band of heroes who protected the island from all threats, both mortal and supernatural. He was said to be so vast that when he lay down to sleep, his head rested in the hills of Antrim while his feet stretched clear across to the mountains of Kerry. He could hunt a deer by running it down on foot, and his voice was the sound of the wind roaring through the glens. He was a protector, a father figure to the land, a benevolent force of nature. He was strong, yes, but he was also wise, having once tasted the salmon of knowledge, gaining all the wisdom of the world in a single bite. Finn MacCool was the hero Ireland needed, and across the water in the misty highlands of Scotland lived the villain he deserved. His name was Benandonner, the Red Man. If Finn was the embodiment of Ireland's rugged beauty and fierce spirit, Benandonner was the embodiment of its fears. He was a monster of pure, unthinking malice, a brute of unimaginable size and strength, even by giant standards. While Finn was a protector, Benandonner was a bully, a reaver, a terror who delighted in his own destructive power. From his fortress on the Scottish coast, he would bellow insults and threats across the narrow sea, his voice a guttural thunder that would shake the very cliffs of Antrim. He mocked Finn's strength, he insulted his honor. He threatened to wade across the North Channel and drag Ireland kicking and screaming back to Scotland as his personal footstool. For years, Finn endured the taunts. He was a chieftain, a leader. He had responsibilities. He couldn't be baited into a foolish fight with a mindless thug. He had his people to think about. But the insults grew louder, more personal, chipping away at his legendary patience. Benandonner's taunts were a constant poison, an unending challenge to his authority, and to the sovereignty of the land he was sworn to protect. How do you fight an enemy you can't even reach? The strip of water between them, the Sea of Moyle, might as well have been a vast ocean. It was a barrier that protected Benandonner, allowing him to spew his venom without consequence, until one day Benandonner went too far. The exact insult is lost to time, but it was the one that finally broke the dam of Finn's restraint. A rage, deep and primal, erupted from within him. It was the fury of the earth itself, a geological event in a single being. He roared back at the Scottish coastline, a challenge that stripped the leaves from the trees and sent seabirds scattering in terror for 100 miles. He would not suffer this beast any longer. If Benandonner would not come to Ireland, then Finn MacCool would bring Ireland to him. He stormed down to the coast, to the very edge of the land where the waves crashed against the black basalt cliffs. He looked out at the churning, impossible sea, and then he looked down at the rock beneath his feet, and he began to build. This was not construction. This was an act of pure, focused fury. He didn't quarry stone. He tore it from the heart of the island, With his bare hands he ripped massive hexagonal columns of basalt from the ground, each one a perfect pillar of rage. He plunged his hands deep into the earth and pulled, the ground groaning in protest as he unearthed thousands upon thousands of these strange, six-sided stones. He worked with a speed and power that defied nature. He was a storm, a hurricane, an earthquake given form. He hurled the columns one by one into the sea, driving them deep into the seabed with thunderous blows from his fists. Each pillar was a curse aimed at his rival. Each impact was a promise of the violence to come. The sea boiled and frothed around him, but he didn't stop. He worked without rest, driven by a singular burning purpose, to build a bridge. A bridge of stone, a bridge of fury, a bridge to his mortal enemy. The causeway grew, stretching out from the Irish coast, a stone path laid across the impossible waves, pointing like a dagger straight at the heart of Scotland. Finally it was done. A magnificent, terrifying highway of interlocking stone, a testament to one giant's colossal anger, spanning the entire North Channel. Finn stood at the edge of his creation, breathing heavily, the rage in his heart now cooled to a hard, cold resolve. He grabbed his massive shillelagh, a club carved from the trunk of an ancient oak, and began to walk. His footsteps boomed across his stone bridge, each one an echoing drumbeat of impending war. The waves crashed against the columns below, spraying salt high into the air, but his path was steady. He was a god of vengeance marching to battle. The coast of Scotland grew larger and larger on the horizon, and with it, the anticipation of the fight to end all fights. He was ready. He was determined. He was Finn MacCool, protector of Ireland, and he was coming to silence the Red Man forever. He reached the Scottish shore and clambered up the rocks, his eyes scanning the highlands for any sign of his foe. And then he saw him, and his heart stopped. The stories, the boasts, the legends, none of it had prepared him for the reality of Benandonner. The Red Man was a mountain. He was a walking apocalypse. He was so colossally, impossibly huge that Finn, himself a giant of legendary proportions, felt like a child in comparison. Benandonner was easily twice his size, with arms as thick as ancient trees and a chest as wide as a hillside. The Scottish giant hadn't even noticed him yet. He was sleeping, his thunderous snores causing small landslides on the cliffs around him. In that single terrifying moment, all the rage, all the pride, all the warrior's certainty drained out of Finn MacCool. It was replaced by something he hadn't felt in centuries. Pure, unadulterated fear. This wasn't a fight. This would be a slaughter. His slaughter. Wisdom, the gift from the salmon of knowledge, screamed at him. It told him that pride was a poor substitute for being alive. Fighting this monster wasn't courage, it was suicide. He didn't hesitate. He turned and he ran. He sprinted back across his newly built causeway, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The booming footsteps were no longer the drums of war. They were the panicked beat of a full-blown retreat. He didn't dare look back. He could feel the sheer size of Benandonner behind him, a gravitational pull of dread. He imagined the Red Man waking up, seeing the bridge, and following him back to Ireland. The thought was so terrifying it spurred him on even faster. He had not just failed to solve his problem. He had built a highway for it to come and destroy everything he had ever sworn to protect. He finally reached the Irish shore, gasping for breath, his mind reeling with panic and shame. He burst into his home, a structure built into the side of a mountain, and collapsed. His wife, the clever and beautiful Unac, rushed to his side, her face a mask of concern. She had never seen her husband, the mighty Finn MacCool, in such a state. "What is it?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. "What has happened?" Finn could barely speak. He told her everything. The rage, the causeway, and the horrifying mountain-sized giant sleeping on the other side. He told her that Benandonner would soon wake, see the bridge, and come across to destroy not just him, but all of Ireland. He was beaten. He was doomed. His brawn had failed him completely. His strength, the very thing that defined him, was now utterly useless. He didn't need a warrior. He needed a miracle. And that miracle had a name, Unac. She was known throughout the land not for her strength, but for her mind. Unac was clever. Not just smart, not just witty. She was a razor-sharp strategist. A woman who saw the world not as a series of obstacles, but as a chessboard where she was always 10 moves ahead. While Finn was out shaking mountains, Unac was at home, moving the pieces of their world into perfect alignment. And now, her husband, the great Finn MacCool, was thundering back across the causeway he had built in a fit of rage, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He burst through the door of their fort, not as a champion but as a fugitive. He was panting, his eyes wide with a terror he had never known. He told her everything. He described the sheer impossible scale of Benandonner, the way the Scottish giant blotted out the sun, the way his every step was an earthquake. He confessed his fear, his certainty of defeat. He explained that he hadn't just built a bridge for a fight. He had built a highway for his own executioner. Unak listened. She didn't panic. She didn't wring her hands or cry out in fear. A slow, thoughtful smile spread across her face. It wasn't a smile of amusement, but of calculation. The gears were turning. She looked at her husband, this mountain of a man, this hero of Ireland, now crumpled in despair, and she saw not an ending but an opportunity. An utterly ridiculous, impossibly brilliant opportunity. "Get up, Finn," she said, her voice calm and steady as a river stone. "Stop your worrying. I have a plan." Finn looked at her, his face a mask of confusion. A plan? What plan could possibly work against a monster who could crush him with one hand? What plan, Unak? Do you have a hidden army? A magic sword? There's nothing that can stop him. Brawn won't stop him, she agreed, tapping her temple. But brains will. Now listen to me and do exactly as I say, no matter how strange it sounds. And it was strange. In fact, it was the most insane, nonsensical plan Finn had ever heard in his life. It was so completely backward and absurd that for a moment, he thought the fear had finally made his wife lose her mind. But then he looked into her eyes, and he saw that familiar, unshakable confidence. He had no other choice. His way had failed. Now he would have to try hers. Her first instruction was for Finn's men, his loyal Fionn, to go out and build. Not weapons, not fortifications, but a cradle. A massive, enormous cradle, carved from the trunk of an ancient oak tree, big enough to hold a giant. Then she set to work in the kitchen. She took out flour, water, and salt, and began to make griddle cakes, a type of flat, hearty bread cooked on a heavy iron plate. She baked a dozen of them, filling the fort with the warm, comforting smell of fresh bread. They looked delicious, golden brown and perfectly round. But then she did something bizarre. She took out another batch of flour, but this time into the dough for another dozen cakes, she kneaded in something else. Not raisins, not seeds, but the heavy, iron griddles themselves. She worked the dark, heavy metal into the center of each dough ball, skillfully concealing it, before baking them to an identical golden brown. From the outside you couldn't tell the difference. One pile of bread was a meal. The other was a pile of stone-breaking, tooth-shattering traps. While the cakes cooled, Unak went to her stores and pulled out what looked like a huge, pale wheel of cheese. It wasn't cheese. It was a large, round, white stone she had painted to look exactly like a wheel of fresh curd. She placed it on the table next to a knife. Finally came the most humiliating part of the plan. She laid out a huge linen nightgown and a baby's bonnet, large enough to fit. Well, large enough to fit Finn. He stared at the garments in disbelief. "Unak, what in the world is this?" "It's your costume," she said matter-of-factly. "You, my dear husband, are going to be my baby." Finn MacCool, the leader of the Fionn, the strongest man in Ireland, balked. The idea was mortifying. It was an insult to his very being. "A baby? Unak, have you gone mad? I'll be a laughingstock. I'd rather face Benandonner and be crushed to dust than be found hiding in a cradle dressed like an infant." Unak's gaze was firm. "And you will be crushed to dust. Is that what you want? For your pride? Do you want Benandonner to destroy you and then me and then everything we've built? Or will you trust me? Just this once, to win a battle with my mind instead of your fists?" He looked at the baby bonnet. He looked at the giant cradle. He thought of the terrifying shadow of Benandonner falling over the Irish coast. He swallowed his pride. It was the bitterest pill he had ever taken, but he swallowed it whole. With a deep, mournful sigh, he allowed his wife to dress him in the ridiculous nightgown and tie the bonnet under his chin. She then led him to the enormous cradle and told him to get in, lie down, and no matter what he heard, no matter what happened, he was not to make a sound. He was to pretend to be a sleeping baby. Finn lay there, feeling like the world's biggest fool, tucked into a cradle like a child. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The smell of the fresh-baked bread filled the air, a strange contrast to the cold dread coiling in his stomach. He could hear Unak humming to herself as she tidied up, making the house look perfectly normal, perfectly domestic. And then it came. It started as a low, distant rumble, a vibration he felt through the wood of the cradle, through the very stone foundations of the fort. Thump, thump, thump. The sound grew louder, closer. The ground began to shake. Mugs rattled on the shelves. Dust trickled from the rafters. A colossal shadow fell over the house, plunging the room into a deep twilight. The footsteps of Benandonner had reached their door. They stopped. For a heart-stopping moment, there was only silence. Finn held his breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the side of the cradle. He could hear his own blood pounding in his ears. This was it. The plan, the bread, the cradle, it was all about to be tested. A knock boomed against the door. It wasn't a rap of knuckles. It was the titanic slam of a fist the size of a boulder. The entire fortress shuddered from the impact. The heavy oak door groaned on its iron hinges. Before Finn could even think, Unaka's voice, as sweet and welcoming as a summer's day, called out, "Come in, come in. Don't be shy, the door is open." The latch clicked and the great door began to swing inward, revealing the mountainous form of the Scottish giant, stooping low to fit his colossal head and shoulders through the frame. Benandonner had arrived, and he was looking for a fight. The air in the cottage grew heavy and cold, thick with the scent of damp wool and distant rain. Benandonner's head, a boulder covered in a thicket of fiery red hair, scraped against the top of the doorframe as he ducked inside. He was a moving mountain, a creature of crag and stone who blotted out the midday sun, casting the entire room into a deep, foreboding twilight. His shadow fell over Unak, a vast, dark stain that seemed to drink the very warmth from the hearth. He straightened up, his head nearly brushing the high-beamed ceiling. His shoulders were as wide as the great oak table, his arms thick as ancient tree trunks. Tucked into his belt was a club that looked more like a sharpened telephone pole, and his eyes, small and hard like chips of granite, scanned the room with a predator's casual disdain. They swept past the spinning wheel, the shelves of pottery, the simmering pot over the fire, and found nothing. No Finn MacCool. A low rumble, like stones grinding together deep within the earth, started in his chest and formed into a word. Where? The voice was not just a sound, it was a physical force. It rattled the plates on the shelves and vibrated through the floorboards into the soles of Unaka's feet. Fear, cold and sharp, tried to seize her heart, to freeze the very blood in her veins. But Unak was Finn MacCool's wife, and she was made of something stronger than simple courage. She was made of wit, of cunning, of a resolve as unyielding as the basalt columns outside. She forced a look of mild annoyance onto her face, as if he were merely a clumsy tradesman who tracked mud on her clean floor. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned back to the massive cradle and gave it a gentle rock. "Hush now, little one," she cooed, her voice a stark, gentle contrast to the giant's guttural boom. "Don't you mind the noise? Just a bit of wind rattling the door." Only then did she turn to face the Scottish giant. She put a hand on her hip. "And who might you be, darkening my doorway and waking my child?" she asked, her tone laced with impatience. Benandonner's brow furrowed. This was not the welcome he expected. He had crossed a sea, walked a causeway of his own making, to find a trembling wife and a cowering husband. He had not expected to be chided. "I am Benandonner," he growled, the name itself a threat. "I'm here for Finn MacCool. He has a challenge to answer." Unak waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, him," she said with an exaggerated sigh. "You've just missed him, I'm afraid. He's gone out. Said he was off to chase a storm cloud that was looking at him funny. You know how he is, always picking fights with the weather." She shook her head as if Finn were a hopelessly impulsive boy. "He won't be back for hours. But you've come a long way. You must be famished. Please sit. Have a piece of bread while you wait." Benandonner's eyes narrowed. Was this a trick? The woman seemed entirely unfazed by his presence. And the cradle, he hadn't truly noticed it before. It was colossal. It was carved from the trunk of a single massive oak tree, and it was easily the size of a small fishing boat. Curiosity warred with his hunger and his suspicion, but the smell of baking bread was intoxicating. He grunted and strode to the table, the floor groaning under his weight. He slumped onto a bench built for a dozen men, and it creaked in protest. Unak bustled over from the hearth, carrying a round, flat loaf of griddle bread. It was golden brown and steaming, smelling of oats and hot stone. She placed it on the table in front of him. "Here you are," she said sweetly, "fresh from the fire." Benandonner didn't hesitate. He seized the loaf in one giant fist, a loaf that would have fed Unak's family for a week, and took a massive bite. And then came a sound that was not thunder. It was a sickening crunch, followed by a roar of pure agony that shook the very foundations of the house. Benandonner spat out a mouthful of bread and blood, clutching his jaw. Two of his enormous yellow teeth, thick as a man's thumb, lay shattered on the table. He stared at the bread in his hand, then at Unak, his eyes wide with pained disbelief. Inside the bite mark, gleaming wickedly, was the dark, unmistakable edge of solid iron. Unak had baked her griddle pan directly into the loaf. "Oh my!" she exclaimed, feigning surprise. "Is something the matter? That's Finn's favorite bread. He eats a dozen of those for breakfast just to sharpen his teeth." As she spoke, a whimper came from the giant cradle. "Oh, the poor dear," Unak said, her voice dripping with maternal sympathy. "The noise has upset him. He must be hungry." She walked to a different basket and pulled out another loaf of bread, identical to the first in every way, except this one was perfectly normal. She broke off a piece and leaned over the cradle. Benandonner watched, his jaw throbbing, as Unak placed the bread into the mouth of the swaddled figure within. He saw a flash of a huge, man-sized head and a tuft of red hair, just like Finn's. The baby began to chew, and then swallow the bread with a happy gurgle. A cold sweat broke out on Benandonner's brow. His mind, slow and methodical like the grinding of glaciers, began to work. He looked at the iron-laced bread that had shattered his teeth. He looked at the gargantuan infant in the boat-sized cradle, who was eating the same bread as if it were soft as cloud, and he tried for the first time to truly imagine the father. What kind of a man had a child this size? What kind of a man ate iron for breakfast to sharpen his teeth? The stories he'd heard of Finn MacCool suddenly seemed like gross understatements. The causeway he'd built, once a monument to his own strength and arrogance, now felt like a terrible, terrible mistake. It was a bridge he had built for his own destruction, leading a monster straight to his front door. Unak saw the fear dawning in his eyes, the subtle shift from arrogance to apprehension. It was time to tighten the net. "He's a strong lad, isn't he?" she said, patting the baby's back. "Takes after his father, of course, though he's still got his baby teeth. They're just coming in now, poor thing." Benandonner, against his better judgment, found himself morbidly curious. He was a giant. He understood strength. He understood size. But this was something else entirely. Nursing his broken jaw, he rose from the bench and lumbered toward the cradle, peering over the edge. There, wrapped in layers of blankets, was Finn MacCool, his great beard tucked away, a baby's bonnet tied absurdly on his head, sucking his thumb with a look of perfect innocence. He looked ridiculous. And yet, to Benandonner, who had just seen this infant devour a loaf of bread that he could not, he looked terrifying. "Baby teeth, you say?" Benandonner mumbled, his voice thick with pain and a growing dread. "Let me see." He felt a strange compulsion to confirm the impossible, to see the proof of this monstrous lineage for himself. He leaned closer, his massive scarred face hovering over Finn's. Unak gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "Go on, dearie," she cooed to Finn. "Show the nice man your lovely new teeth." Finn stopped sucking his thumb. He looked up at the colossal face of his rival hanging over him, and he opened his mouth. Benandonner, foolishly, leaned in closer, and extended a single sausage-like finger to feel the baby's gums. In a flash, Finn's jaws snapped shut. It wasn't a bite. It was a vice. Benandonner screamed, a high-pitched shriek of shock and agony that was entirely unbecoming of a giant. He tried to pull his hand back, but Finn's teeth, very much not baby teeth, had locked onto the tip of his finger, grinding into the bone. The strength in that bite was unbelievable. It was the strength of Finn MacCool, concentrated into a single point of excruciating pressure. With a final desperate heave, Benandonner ripped his hand free. He stared at it, his face pale with horror. The end of his finger, the very finger he used to point and threaten and command, was gone, bitten clean off. He looked from his mangled hand to the baby in the cradle, who was now calmly chewing on the severed digit. The last vestiges of Benandonner's courage evaporated. The bread, the cradle, the bite. It all crashed down on him in a suffocating avalanche of pure, unadulterated terror. This wasn't a baby. This was a monster. And if this was the son, what in all the heavens and hells was the father? He didn't want to know. He didn't want to be here when Finn MacCool, the storm chaser, the Iron Eater, the father of this demon child, returned home. His eyes, wide with panic, darted around the cottage. They saw the door. The open door that led to the Causeway. To Scotland. To safety. He had to leave. Now. But a hand, steady and sure, caught his arm. It was Unak. Her face was a mask of impossible calm. A placid lake in the heart of a hurricane. There was no fear in her eyes. Only a fierce, burning intelligence. She shook her head. A silent command that was louder than any shout. "Trust me," her eyes said. "Trust the plan." And in that moment, Finn MacCool, the man who could wrestle storms and bend iron, did the hardest thing he had ever done. He surrendered his fate to another. He let his wife lead him back to the cradle, back to the swaddling clothes, and lay down. He closed his eyes, his heart a war drum against his ribs, and listened. He didn't have to listen for long. It began as a tremor, a deep thrumming that vibrated up through the stone floor of the cottage. Then came the sound, a rhythmic, earth-shattering boom. Boom. Boom that was not merely heard but felt in the bones, in the teeth. Each footstep was a small earthquake. Each one was closer than the last. The very air grew thick, heavy with a presence so immense it seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. The shadow that fell across the open doorway wasn't a shadow of a man. It was an eclipse. Benandonner had arrived. He had to stoop to get his head and shoulders through the doorframe, his colossal form blocking out the sky. His hair was the color of rust and thunderclouds, his beard a tangled thicket of red wire. His eyes, small and cruel, scanned the cottage. They were the eyes of a predator, looking for the one thing he had crossed the sea to find, to break, to kill. His gaze fell upon Unak, who was calmly kneading dough at a table, humming a soft tune as if she were merely preparing the evening meal. She looked up, feigning surprise. "Well, now you're a big fella, aren't you? Lost are we? Finn's not home, I'm afraid. He's out chasing that rival of his, Benandonner. Says he's going to teach him a lesson." The giant grunted, a sound like rocks grinding together. His eyes narrowed, sweeping the room again. And then he saw it. The cradle. A cradle so large it could have served as a boat for 10 men. And inside a baby of truly unbelievable proportions, wrapped in blankets, sleeping soundly. Benandonner stared. He had seen many strange things in his life, but nothing like this. He took a hesitant step inside, the floorboards groaning in protest. He pointed a finger the size of a small tree trunk at the cradle. "What is that?" Unak smiled warmly. "Ah, that's just our wee boy. Finn's son." The Scottish giant's face was a canvas of disbelief. He crept closer, peering down at the gargantuan infant. Finn, playing his part, let out a small gurgling snore. Benandonner was speechless. The sheer size of the child was staggering. Unak, seeing her hook was set, went in for the kill. "You look tired from your journey," she said, her voice dripping with hospitality. "Sit down, rest yourself. I've just made some griddle cakes. You must be hungry." She placed a plate on the table. On it were several round, flat cakes, golden brown and steaming. Benandonner, his mind still reeling from the sight of the baby, took one. He was in fact ravenously hungry. He lifted the cake to his mouth and bit down. Crack! A sound like a gunshot echoed through the cottage. Benandonner roared in agony, clutching his jaw. He spat out the cake and with it 2 of his own massive yellow teeth. He looked at the cake in his hand. It was as hard as stone. Unak clicked her tongue in mock sympathy. "Oh, my apologies. Those must be the ones I made for Finn. He likes them with a bit of substance." Then she walked over to the cradle, picked up an identical-looking cake from a plate beside it, and handed it to the baby. "Here you are, my sweet," she cooed. Finn, knowing what was expected of him, took the cake, a real soft one Unak had prepared, and stuffed it into his mouth, chewing with loud, obnoxious gusto. He swallowed it in 2 bites and then looked up at Benandonner with a gummy, infant smile. Benandonner stared. He stared at his own broken teeth on the floor. He stared at the cake in his hand, which he now saw had a dark metallic glint. It was the iron griddle she had baked inside. And then he stared at the baby, a baby who had just devoured one of these iron-laced rocks, as if it were a piece of soft bread. A cold, creeping dread began to snake its way up the giant's spine. His mind, slow and methodical, began to connect the pieces. The size of the cottage, the size of the cradle, the impossible size of the baby, and the baby's diet. Iron. This family ate iron. His gaze shifted from the baby back to Unak, and a single terrifying thought bloomed in his mind, a black flower of pure horror. He leaned in, his voice a low, trembling whisper. "If that," he said, pointing a shaking finger at the cradle. "If that is his son, what in the name of all that is unholy does the father look like?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Didn't need to be. In Benandonner's imagination, Finn MacCool was no longer a rival giant. He was a primordial god, a creature of impossible scale and power, a father to a child who dwarfed mountains and sharpened his teeth on metal. He wasn't just big. He was fundamentally, terrifyingly other. Panic, absolute and undiluted, seized him. The fight was over before it had even begun. He didn't just want to leave. He needed to erase his path here. He needed to ensure this monstrous, iron-eating titan could never, ever follow him back to Scotland. He turned and scrambled out of the cottage, moving with a speed that defied his size. He didn't just run back across the causeway. He fled. And as he fled, he ripped the world apart behind him. With every panic step, he kicked and stomped and tore at the stone bridge he had so proudly built. He hurled the massive hexagonal columns into the churning sea, his fear giving him a strength even rage never could. He ripped up the stones not just to retreat, but to annihilate the very connection between the two lands, to create a chasm of raging water between himself and the unthinkable horror he imagined Finn MacCool to be. From their doorway, Finn and Unak watched as the magnificent bridge was torn asunder, column by column, until all that was left was a jagged, broken stump of a path on their side, and a chaotic jumble of stones disappearing into the waves. The thunder of the giant's retreat faded, leaving only the sound of the wind and the sea. The war was over. Ireland was safe, and not a single punch had been thrown. Finn slowly got out of the cradle. He looked at his wife, the architect of this impossible victory. He, the strongest warrior in all of Ireland, had been saved not by his fists, but by a quick mind, a loaf of bread, and a woman's unwavering courage. He didn't feel shame. He felt awe. And so the legend was sealed. The Giant's Causeway stands today, a bizarre and beautiful scar on the Irish coast. 40,000 interlocking basalt columns, a geometric marvel stretching from the cliffs into the sea. Geologists will tell you a different story. They'll speak of a Paleocene volcanic eruption, some 60 million years ago. They'll explain how molten basalt, flowing from a fissure in the earth, cooled and contracted, fracturing into the hexagonal pillars we see today. A story of pressure, chemistry, and time. And they are not wrong. But a story that only explains how the stones got there misses the point entirely. It doesn't explain why they matter. The legend of Finn MacCool and Benandonner does. It's a story that tells us that the biggest monster isn't always the one with the biggest fist, but the one we build in our own minds. It's a story that reminds us that brute force is a fragile, clumsy thing when faced with wit and ingenuity. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to put on a baby's bonnet and trust in a plan. The Causeway isn't just a geological wonder. It's a monument to a good story, a testament to the idea that sometimes the greatest giants can be defeated not with a sword, but with a clever lie. The stones may have been forged by the planet's fire, but the legend, the part that endures, the part that truly explains the soul of the place, that was forged by us.